Good morning, friends. Today we are going to learn about our second lecture of environmental studies and disaster management. Our today's topic is natural resources, so that are renewable and non-renewable resources. So first of all, in this slide, you might have observed that here it's one picture you are observing, and which indicates there are the presence of several things, so that we can call it as an natural resources. So if you look at meaning of the resource, that means it is anything which is used to sustain our life. It is called as resource. So what is exactly meant by natural resources? Natural resources are resources that exist without any action of humankind, so that they are present naturally, so that are called as natural resources. So how these natural resources exist? So these are exist without action of humankind. So it includes all the valued characteristics, say for example magnetic, gravitational field, electrical properties, forces which are present on the earth. That includes sunlight, atmosphere, water, land, several minerals, along with vegetation of crops, animal life. So all these things are called as natural resources. That means these are the resources that exist without action of humankind. They are present naturally, so that they are called as natural resources. So there are various ways of classification by which we can classify these natural resources. There are various methods of categorizing natural resources. It may include origin, stage of development, by their renewability, their nature. There are several ways. In today's lecture, we will learn about what are the different classifications of the natural resources. First classification, that we may call it as on the basis of origin, from where they are originated, whether they are biotic or abiotic, whether they are living or non-living. So we can categorize natural resources on the basis of origin into two types. So that is biotic resources and abiotic resources. Biotic resources which are obtained from the biosphere. Biosphere means living component of the organic material. For example, forests, animals, and these are the materials which are obtained from them. For example, fossil fuels, coal, petroleum, that are also included in this category because they are formed from decayed to this organic matter. Abiotic resources means what? Abiotic resources are those resources that came from non-living things. That means these are the non-organic material. For example, abiotic resources that includes land, fresh water, air, elements on the earth. In this photograph, you can clearly observe that what are the differences between these biotic resources and abiotic resources. Here in the biotic component, you can just compare with these living things and non-living things. So here are the presence of plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, protists. And in case of abiotic resources, there are presence of water, soil, light, minerals. This is the classification of the natural resources on the basis of its origin. Number second, that is, if we consider the stage of the development, we can classify natural resources into four types. First type, that is a potential resource. Potential resource means what? What you can observe onto this slide. For example, presence of uranium in the Ladakh or high-speed winds. The potential resources are those that may be used for future, but at present they are not using. We are not using. That kind of resources are called as potential resources. Another example is that petroleum in the sedimentary rock. So until and unless we cannot drill it out, we cannot utilize it. So that resources are called as potential resources. What is meant by actual resources? The resources which are actually we are using, For example, woods, some technology, woods, or the resources which are at present that are have been surveyed and quantitatively and qualified, and these are currently in use. So that resources are called as actual resources. For example, our fuel, that is our actual resources. Use of electricity, that is our actual resources. Reserve resources means what? The part of an actual resource that can be developed profitably in the future, so that it is called as reserve resources. And what is meant by stock resources? These are the resources that can be that has been surveyed, but at present we are not using that resources, are called as stock resources. That means they are remains in the stock. Here actual resources may be called as an reserve resources, but the stock resources, they are at present we are not using because of lack of technology. Now just look at the differences between potential resources and actual resources. Potential resources means what? So a potential resource that are not being used currently, but actual resources that is one which is we are using currently, that are called as actual resources. What is another difference? A potential resource can prove useful and become an actual resource in the future. For future time we may use that kind of resource, but actual resource means what? An actual resource might have been potential resource in the past, and but they are presently they are used, it may be end up in the future, so that resources are called as actual resources. What are the example of these potential resources that we already learned? That is uranium deposit in the Ladakh. And what is the example of this actual resource? That is example, that is coal deposit. What is another difference between potential resource and actual resource? The entire quantity of potential resource may not be known because we didn't use it, but in the case of this actual resources, the quantity of an actual resource is known, it may be known. So that is that was the second classification. Now the third classification, that is classification of the resources on the basis of renewability. So that is renewable resources, and another one is that is non-renewable resources. Renewable resources means what? That are the one that can be replenished or that can be reproduced. Some of them like sunlight, air, wind, so that they can be used again and again, so that resources are called as renewable resources. Non-renewable resources means what? So these are formed over a long geological period of the time. That kind of resources are called as non-renewable resources. That resources, if we'll use it, so that may be depleted from the nature. That resources are called as non-renewable resources. Here in this photograph you can see that examples of renewable resources and non-renewable resources: sunlight, forest, energy. So these are the examples of renewable resources, and here are the examples of non-renewable resources. In this case you are observing, so these are examples of non-renewable resources that cannot be renewed. Once they are used, that means it is finished. That resources are called as non-renewable resources. Now the fourth classification, that is classification on the basis of availability of the natural resources. It can be categorized into two parts, that is inexhaustible and another one that is exhaustible. Inexhaustible means what? So that these are the resources which are present in unlimited quantity. If say for example the example of the sunlight, this is sun and here you are utilizing sunlight energy. So is it going to exist? Is it going to exhaust? No, it will remain as such. That kind of resources are called as inexhaustible resources. For example, air which is present, that kind of air, how much quantity of air you are utilizing, it doesn't matter, it is again going to form. That kind of resources are called as inexhaustible resources. But in the case of exhaustible resources, the amount of these resources are very limited. They can be exhausted by human activity if we will use in long term. For example, coal, petroleum, natural gases. So these are the examples of inexhaustible resources. Uh, these are the examples of exhaustible resources. This is the difference between exhaustible resources and inexhaustible resources. Exhaustible resources, these are resources which are present in limited amount. Inexhaustible, so most of these resources are in endless supply, that there is no end to supply for these resources. Exhaustible resources, they can't easily replenished. For example, we are using the fuel, so it is very difficult to replenish it, reproduce it. It requires several years of time. But inexhaustible resources, they can be easily replenished. The examples that we learn about exhaustible resources are biomass, geothermal energy. These are the examples of exhaustible resources. Inexhaustible resources, these are the natural gases, minerals, so ions. So they can be converted from one form into another form. So that's why these resources are inexhaustible resources. If you look at this classification of the resources on the basis of distribution, that is ubiquitous resources and localized resources. In this photograph, what we can see that here, so these are the resources. So these are the present everywhere, water, air. These are the examples of ubiquitous resources. They are present entirely on the earth's surface. That resources are called as ubiquitous resources. But what about localized resources? These are the examples of gold, diamond. These are the resources which are present in a limited area. That resources are called as localized resources. This was the classification on the basis of distribution of the resources. Next classification on the basis of source. In this diagram, in this photograph, you can observe that what are the different resources. For example, water resources, forest resources, mineral resources, marine resources. If you just recall this, you may recall this photograph, you may clearly understand that what are the different kinds of resources. Next classification on the basis of chemical composition. Chemical composition means what? That resources can be divided into three parts on the basis of chemical composition, that is organic resources, inorganic resources and mixed resources. In this diagram, you may observe that, so these are the examples of organic, these are the examples of inorganic resources. Here are the few examples of organic and inorganic resources. What are the problems which are associated with these natural resources? If we will continually use these resources, that will leads into the majorly food security. Food security we can categorize into the two parts: food safety and food security. Food safety means what? Availability of the quality foods. It is a scientific discipline which describes handling, preparation, storage of the food. Okay, so that is related with the food safety. And food security means what? Food security means that our population is growing day by day. It will be our challenge how to cope up with to fulfill the demands of all the population, that it is called as food security. What are the main components of the food security? That we will discuss in more detail in our next few lectures, but here try to understand that what are the main components of the food security. First is availability, whether we are having availability of all the food resources or food resources. Accessibility, stability and its utilization. Availability means what? Having sufficient quantity of appropriate food available. Accessibility means what? Having adequate income of other resources. Stability means what? Having a stable and continuous food resources. And utilization means what? Having adequate dietary intake and ability to absorb all the nutrients in the body. These are called as, these are the main components of the food security. And if we'll continually use these resources, what will be the impact in our agriculture? So as we are observing, each and every farmer, for what purpose he is interesting? To get more and more yield from less amount of resources. But we will continually use such kinds of practices. What will happen with our agriculture? Due to this overutilization of the fertilizers, due to the over increase in the population, increase in the demand, or to fulfill the demands of our growing population, so there is a use of tremendous use of fertilizers, pesticides, and several things which deteriorates the quality of the soil. In more detail, we'll discuss this point in our next few lecture. There is a separate lecture. So this is all about our today's lecture, that is classification of the resources and impact of these resources if we will not use properly. Thank you very much for observing or for watching this video clip. Thank you very much.